Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett. Welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'd like to talk about the ultimate UFO experience, and that is onboard encounters. The title of today's episode is The Onboard UFO Experience, 6 Shocking Cases. These are some really unusual and extensive cases. I've chosen 6 coming from various locations across our planet, including Springfield, Missouri, Tarboro, North Carolina, Seattle, Washington, one in the French Pyrenees, one in Kalgoorlie, Australia, and the last one in the Cariboo region of British Columbia, Canada. These are cases all involving people who, of course, have been taken on board a craft, interacted directly with ETs face to face, some involving quite a bit of information and conversations. So yeah, the most extensive of all encounters. I mean, when someone has an onboard experience, there's really no chance of misperception. This is not a light in the sky. This is far more than even a face-to-face encounter with humanoids. In these kinds of cases, people are literally enveloped by what we call the UFO phenomenon. And these cases, I think, have the most to teach us about what's going on here. They certainly have the most information, and I find them the most fascinating as well. And there are a lot of them. According to the Roper poll of 1991, they did a survey and found that about 1 in 50 people show the markers of being a UFO contactee. So although we only have many thousands of cases that are fully documented and on record, it likely numbers in the millions. So let's get started. And the first case I want to talk about today, I was in a UFO. This is a really interesting and extensive case which took place in 1972 in the Cariboo region of British Columbia, Canada. I like this case for a lot of reasons. It is a single witness case. It does have landing traces and an apparent alien artifact, but it also has a lot of really extensive conversations with the ETs, interactions. This case comes from Holly McCluskey, the director of the website UFO BC. And what a case this is. The incident took place in 1972 at a remote cabin. This is located next to a little lake and an old abandoned sawmill somewhere in the wilderness of the Cariboo region of British Columbia, Canada. The witness is an anonymous gentleman, we'll call him Steve. At the time of his experience, he was about 24 years old. He and his girlfriend were staying at a tiny trapper's cabin about 15 miles from the nearest town. It was a late summer afternoon when Steve stepped outside to look at the scenery and immediately saw 2 dull gray saucer-shaped craft moving slowly across the sky. He estimates that each of them was about 30 feet across, totally silent, and as Steve says in his own words, "I just stood there and watched them. They were heading for the lake. I was watching the second one go by and it zapped me. I just felt it, vibrating. It started on my right side, went through my whole body really fast, and then it came across the other side of my body. As soon as they did that to me, then I knew that they were gonna go land by the lake, and I knew that I had to go down there right away." So he rushed back into the cabin and immediately told his girlfriend to get up and come with him to see the UFOs. And strangely, she said, "No, I don't want to." Usually she said yes to any adventure, but despite asking her at least 3 times, she still declined. So frustrated, Steve left her at the cabin and walked briskly to the lake. This was pretty close, less than 500 feet away, and sure enough, there were the 2 saucers, sitting on the hard rock ground, each about 90 feet apart from each other. He said the closer one had an open door with a ramp leading to the ground. So he walked right up to it. He could now hear a low rumbling sound coming from the craft, and peering inside he did see a room in there. So he walked up the ramp and into the craft. He found himself in a round room, turned to the left, and immediately saw 2, quote, space aliens staring right at him. And as Steve says, their skin is really gray everywhere, and it's really wrinkly. Their faces are wrinkly gray skin and two black eyes. They were about 4 feet high. They were both wearing white smocks like a doctor would wear. The smocks came down past their knees, halfway down to their calves. They had long sleeves. It looked like two little men standing there. So it was immediately apparent to Steve that these people were not from Earth. He felt a wave of shock and fear. He looked back at the open door behind him and considered making a run for it. And this is one of the ETs spoke telepathically in clear, concise English, saying, "It's okay, come on in." So he was shocked to hear them speak English, but they also seemed very friendly. So he walked up to them. He could now see that they had only 3 fingers on each hand. He says their eyes were twice the size of humans, all black. No visible ears, just a hole. Tiny hole for a mouth, no visible lips, a small flat nose, sort of pear-shaped heads with no hair. And looking around him, he saw 2 tables or beds, each on a single central pedestal. There was a small 4-foot-long counter. The walls, he said, looked brownish, curved up into the ceiling. He said the entire area looked totally spotless. He did see a doorway leading to a wedge-shaped room. Otherwise, the room was surprisingly empty. So suddenly, he blanked out. He lost consciousness. The next thing he knows, he's feeling a sensation of pain and woke up to find himself lying on one of the tables, stark naked, feeling really groggy and tired. One of the ETs immediately spoke to the other and said, "Hurry up, grab him, he's waking up." So the ET that was standing next to Steve grabbed his arm while the other rushed to the counter. Steve struggled at first, but he was too groggy to resist. All he could do was really stare at the ET while the ET stared back at him. Very quickly, the other little man returned, and Steve promptly lost consciousness again. The next thing he knew, he was standing up holding onto a railing of some kind, still groggy, still unable to move. One of the ETs stood behind him and pursed Steve, massaged his prostate, while the other stood in front of him and obtained a sperm sample. And again he lost consciousness. When he woke up, he was now back on the table, now fully clothed. He was able to move. He got up, started walking around the room, and he started asking them questions. He doesn't really remember what the questions were. He did see a picture on the wall, on the far wall, which looked like it showed 4 planets. He suspected one of them was Earth. He couldn't be sure. But he continued to explore the room, walked over to the other side where he saw another short counter, 2 small stools, again held up by a single pedestal. On this counter he did see a small flat television screen built flush into the counter. It had a small 6-inch high joystick next to it, 3 small black buttons. He had the impression it was the control panel for the ship, and he knew better than to touch it. Looking around, he saw a hallway leading to another room. Strangely, he says, he felt no fear, and in fact felt strangely comfortable, blasé. He continued to walk around. He looked down towards where he had come into the craft and saw with surprise that the door was open and that it was now early morning, just starting to get light. It was clear to him that he had been inside this craft for the entire evening. So at this point, one of the ETs walked up to him and said, "Okay, you can go now." And feeling somewhat foolish for asking, Steve asked, "Can you give me something so I can prove I was in here?" And as Steve says, the alien kind of looked at me for a sec, then turned around and walked back to the medical counter. He came back and handed me something. I put out my left hand and took it. I think it was a metal slate, about 4 inches by 6 inches. That's what I'm guessing. I never really looked at it and turned it over to see if it had writing or anything on it. I turned and walked down the stairs, along the ramp, and straight out of the UFO with this thing in my hand. So he walked away from the craft and, turning around, saw them both quickly rise up and fly away. For some reason, he felt like they were still watching him, and he took this metal object that they had given him and tossed it at a rotten tree stump. It fluttered to the ground. He's not sure why he did this, why he didn't take it back to the cabin. But then he walked back to the cabin. His girlfriend was still asleep, so he crawled into bed and fell asleep. and when he woke up, he asked his girlfriend, "How come you didn't come down to the lake last night to see the UFOs?" She looked at him blankly and didn't answer, and they never talked about it again. As Steve says, "I don't know why. I guess maybe we weren't supposed to talk about it." He did go back to the UFO landing site later that afternoon and saw a couple of tracks and indentations in the ground where the craft had rested, but as he says, "I never went back to look for the thing I threw in the bush. I don't know why. I kind of turned my head to look, but then I just kept walking." Wasn't long after that, maybe a couple of weeks, we moved back into town. Eventually, we went our own separate ways. Though Steve never tried to retrieve the alien artifact, and he kept his encounter secret from everyone, except once, when someone he knew was talking about UFOs, he blurted out, "Yeah, I was in a UFO once." But as Steve says, they just looked at me and continued with what they were talking about. But Steve's sticking to his story many years later. During an interview in 2023, he said he was perfectly willing to take a lie detector test. And he said that the reason he had decided to come forward is because, quote, "I'm 76 now, and my health isn't really good. This is the first time anybody has heard this story. I wanted to tell the story a few times throughout my life, but I didn't. I thought, well, maybe somebody wants to hear it. So now they have." Such a shame in that case that the witness did not keep the alleged alien artifact. That certainly would have brought this case to a whole new level. But it's still an interesting case. Yes, it is one person's testimony. It's in essence purely anecdotal. But the witness is so obviously sincere and honest, willing to take a lie detector test. It's a really poignant case. And I just found it super fascinating because of how he interacted with these ETs. Now let's move to another really amazing onboard encounter which took place in Tarboro, North Carolina. In fact, I call this one Taken in Tarboro. This occurred on November 12, 1976. It is a multiple witness case involving two teenagers who initially did have missing time, but were able to recall what happened. And it's a fascinating case because they did have a very close-up sighting with this UFO and a humanoid, and it turned out to be an onboard experience. Makes me wonder how many cases where people see a UFO close-up, don't realize that they had missing time, or simply suppress the memory of going on board. I think it's probably a lot more common than we realize. Hard to say for sure, but I think you'll find this case quite compelling. This next encounter, reported by two teenage boys, was reported to MUFON and investigated by Dr. Leo Sprinkle, PhD. The two witnesses are James Howard, he was 15 years old at the time, and his friend Brian Hollis, age 14. It was about 6:15 on the evening of November 12, 1976, as the two boys were walking near their homes in Tarboro, North Carolina. In fact, for the past few weeks, they had been seeing a strange light over the nearby golf course and river not far from their homes. As one of the boys says, "Every night I'd strangely be drawn down to watch that light." So, on November 12, events came to a head when, as one of the boys says, "We saw a disc with lights, a disc-shaped, dark metallic object that had three separate lights fixed by equal distance underneath. We first observed the object after exiting my home. The object was first sighted coming out of the east, then slowly descended into a large wooded area where we could see the lights between the trees. The lights were observed shining inside the tree line. We stood out in a vacant field watching this yellow to white glow, when we then noticed smaller twinkling white lights zigzagging in and outside of the tree line. When the object came overhead, it was about 500 feet to 750 feet above the ground. A glow of red, green, and white lights underneath highlighted the outline of the object, and it appeared to land in the woods. So this object had landed only about 1,000 feet away from one of their homes, and frightened, both boys decided to run back home, and as they did so, they saw something very strange. As one of them says, We observed a strange person floating near the creek. So this figure came floating out of the woods only about 450 feet away. They could see instantly that this was not a normal person. It was very tall, maybe as tall as 9 feet. It appeared to be wearing a milky white suit, a jumpsuit of some kind. It had a diamond-shaped red helmet. The head underneath the helmet looked blackish gray. It seemed to have short legs and no visible feet. The arms were of normal length and became dark below the elbows. They watched this for a good amount of time, about 15 minutes. And during this time, they said that it was weird because everything seemed to be moving in slow motion and in perfect silence. At one point, this figure stopped, seemed to look directly at the boys, then floated towards a billboard and disappeared behind it. So the boys ran home and told their parents, and arriving home, they saw that it was now 7:30, an hour later than it should have been. And following this incident, one of the boys, James, began to suffer from nightmares and sleepwalking. And after this continued for a few months, they finally contacted MUFON and were put in touch with Dr. Leo Sprinkle. He suggested regressive hypnosis. James agreed and actually went to the University of North Carolina and had 3 sessions over a 2-month period. Sessions which of course revealed that both he and Brian were in fact taken on board. Under hypnosis, James recalled that after they had seen this disc land and then the smaller lights darting around, they had gone to investigate them, and both boys were suddenly rendered paralyzed, unable to move, as 2 or more beings approached them. They were described as about 5 feet tall, wearing milky white close-fitting jumpsuits, black gloves up to the elbows, black knee-length boots, a metallic red diamond-shaped helmet which fit snugly over their heads. He said their faces were ashen gray. They had a very small nose, a small slit for a mouth, large, dark, almond-shaped eyes, and bald heads. Very much the typical grays so often reported. James says that both of the boys were levitated above the ground and floated into a small clearing about 300 feet into the woods. And resting on the ground in this clearing was a saucer-shaped craft, about 15 feet high, 75 feet wide, pretty big. It had a metallic gray surface and a thick middle rim around the perimeter. So, as they approached, James saw a doorway open up about 3 feet wide, 6 feet tall. You could see a yellow-white light coming out of it. And both of them were brought on board and separated, each going down a brightly lit corridor. James says he was brought into a dark room and placed on a short table. Another figure entered the room and began to give James an examination and question him. Now, if James's memory gets a little hazy at this point, he's unable to remember the full examination or what the conversation was, other than he did not really enjoy it. He felt it was a bit one-sided. He also said something interesting, that the being never moved its mouth. So this was apparently telepathic. He said this being was wearing a dark gray diver's suit with no helmet and had an oversized bald head. So the next thing James knows, he's back out in the field standing next to his friend Brian. Both boys are frightened and run back to the house, and it was then that they saw this floating humanoid being as they prepared to cross the road back to their house. So at this point, neither of them had any conscious memory of having been on board. Now, after James's hypnosis session, his nightmares did go away. He stopped having anxiety about the incident, so that was definitely helpful. And here's a really interesting afternote, because 5 years later in 1981, when James turned 21, he enlisted in the Air Force. And to his surprise, he was assigned the job specialty of Target Intelligence 201X1, which required him to work with top secret projects and information at Cannon Air Force Base in Colorado. Now, even more surprising, the Defense Intelligence Agency, he says, sent a field agent to him to interview him about this childhood UFO incident. They actually required him to draw the craft and the beings that he had seen, which he did, and he says that following this interview, his top secret clearance was in fact approved. Truly fascinating case, especially that little aftermath there where the witness joins the Navy and they basically force him to testify and do drawings about his encounter before he gets his top secret clearance, which they gave to him anyway. So that just goes to show once again that our governments do know all about the subject and are not being truthful or transparent. But we know this. Disclosure, yeah, we're seeing bits of it happen, but I'm not sure they'll ever be fully truthful or transparent. Certainly not voluntarily or willingly. We will see. Our future promises it to be quite interesting either way. Now let's move to another amazing case. This is one of my favorite in this bunch. I actually like all of them in this compilation. These onboard experiences are so fascinating. But this case is particularly interesting because the witness did remember his encounter without the aid of hypnosis. That's always a plus, I think, because although hypnosis, I think, works if done correctly, it is nevertheless controversial. So I call this one Yurani, and that actually is the name of the ET given to the witness. That alone, I think, makes this case pretty fascinating because we don't have a lot of cases where ETs actually give their names. There are quite a few of them, but not as common as you might think. This one took place in July of 1981 in Seattle, Washington. And again, it is a single witness case, but boy, this guy was able to interact with the ETs and have long conversations, apparently taken to their planet. So it's an incredibly extensive and interesting case. This next case comes from researcher David W. Chase and was published in his amazing book, A Visual Guide to Alien Beings. He's quite an accomplished artist. This case occurred in Seattle, Washington in July of 1981 to an anonymous young man, we'll call him Robert. At the time he was 16 years old. It was a warm evening and Robert was out playing frisbee with his dog. His mom was in the house and had turned off her bedroom light and gone to bed. The front door was still open to air out the house. The night was dark and cloudless, but suddenly clouds began to quickly roll in. It looked to Robert like a storm was coming in pretty quickly. The dog ran inside, and David was right behind the dog, running inside, when suddenly he found himself paralyzed, unable to move. The clouds had moved in overhead by this point, and he could see a bright light in them. It began flashing red and blue, and he heard a sound which he said was kind of like a cricket. Without warning, he found that he was being struck by a beam of light coming from above. He could feel the heat from it, and he suddenly found himself rising above his home, and he could actually see the bright city lights of Seattle all around him below. The next thing he knew, he was inside a craft. It was very dark and shadowy, and there was an entity with cat-like eyes staring at him. He felt a wave of fear. Next thing he knows, he's waking up in bed. His clothes and shoes are still on. He's tired, he feels unwell, and in fact he became sick enough that he went to the hospital where he remained for 3 days. Now for many years this was all he recalled, but some years later he spontaneously recalled what happened during this missing time. In a 1995 interview with David Chase, Robert said that after being pulled up this beam of light, he saw the bottom of the craft, which looked like black metal. It had green, white, blue, and red strobe-like lights circling the edge, 3 round, circular, blue, white, yellowish lights, which he believed was the power source. He said that the beam of light that lifted him up into the ship came from the center bottom of the craft. And once inside this craft, he was immediately greeted by a half-human, half-gray alien being who introduced herself as Yurani. Now, she was pretty tall, about 5 feet 7 inches, slender, somewhat frail looking, and had Asian-looking facial features. Robert described her pretty vividly and in detail. He said her skin was pale white with some hints of pink gray. She had a large face, which looked almost swollen like a person with the mumps, a long thin neck, large cat-like eyes with dark gray irises, no eyelashes, prominent cheekbones, a high forehead, no hair, small flat nose, small lips, no visible ears. Her skin was very, very smooth, with no visible pores. He saw only 2 or 3 visible wrinkles on her forehead. He said her hands were long, 3 thin fingers and a thumb, no fingernails. Her shoulders were pretty broad, her arms were very long, reaching almost down to the knees, and she had long, narrow feet. She was wearing a pale gray-white, tight-fitting robe, which did show her feminine figure. It had long, narrow, full-length sleeves. She wore dark black ankle-length boots that looked like they were made of some kind of cloth. He did see later that these beings had 4 toes with no little toe. But this being, Yurani, was wearing a necklace. It was of sort of a black string, and it had a 3-inch wide gold pendant on the end. And on this pendant there was a black Z-like symbol engraved on its surface. And he actually asked about it. And she answered. She told him that it represented the name of their race. And she gave the name. It was Zodoranians. Now, per Robert, this being looked more human than gray, perhaps a hybrid. He said that she looked human enough that if she were to wear sunglasses and a hat, she could pass as human. Looking around, he saw dozens of other beings like her. They moved around this craft by gliding across the floor, not walking. He did see a few other humans who had also apparently been picked up by the ETs. He said the air in the ship was cold, stuffy, and moist, smelled like a cross between a locker room and a refrigerator. Now, Yurani then proceeded to give David an examination. He was glided across the floor like the other figures, and he found that Yurani was easily able to override his willpower and put thoughts into his mind or take them out. She communicated with him telepathically, usually using images, showed him various mental pictures of the future about his personal life and world events, such as the election of President Bill Clinton, which ended up coming true. He said that they were able to speak verbally in a high-pitched voice, but it did not sound at all human. Now, Robert thought that Yurani looked to be about 30 or 40 years old. But apparently reading his mind, Yurani explained that no, she was more than 200 years old, and explained that they don't age as quickly as humans do. She said that they are mostly vegetarians and that they eat a lot of brightly colored fruit, and actually demonstrated this for David. She said that she worked mostly as a scientist and a doctor, and that they were here on Earth to observe humans and to repair their own genetics. She explained that long ago their planet had become overpopulated, so that they were forced to limit their population growth, and in the process of doing this had messed around with their genetics and lost some of their capacity for emotion. No longer were able to love or laugh or cry or have the same strong passions as humans, and were not able to reproduce normally like we do. She told him that they do live in peace, but now recognizing the value of emotions and realizing that their race is dying out, they are studying human emotions and learning how to breed. And in exchange, they are attempting to help humans to become less aggressive. So he was also given a tour of the craft. He was shown laboratories, sleeping quarters for the crew, restrooms, which he said contained a device that could be pulled from the wall, kind of reminded him of a vacuum cleaner. He was then, at one point, actually taken to their planet, which he said had a dim orange sunset sky all day long. He was shown some of their craft, which looked long and cylindrical with thrusters coming out from the bottom part of the craft. He was shown that they live in round-like buildings. This was a long experience. He estimates that it lasted probably 3 days, maybe even as long as a week. But, interestingly, when he was returned back to his room, only a few hours had passed. And of course, he had almost no memory of what had happened during all this missing time. Pretty unusual case for sure, but these are details we hear again and again in these on-board encounters. It's such a shame there's so much skepticism and disbelief and ridicule and confusion and fear surrounding the subject, the cover-up. All of this makes it very difficult for witnesses to come forward and share their stories, and certainly most do not want their names attached to it. Totally understandable. But it would be a very different world if this subject was treated differently. And we're moving in the right direction. Don't think we're there yet. Now let's move to another case where the witness did come forward, did allow his name to be used. He was actually a very well-known author and went public with his story to great consequence. His story ended up becoming very popular. I call this one 7 Hours on Board an Alien Spacecraft. This occurred on August 31st, 1981 in the French Pyrenees. It's quite an extensive encounter. It's sort of your basic contactee case. The whole contactee era of the 1950s never ended. It was sort of forced underground and people stopped talking about it. But the fact is, people have been having these kinds of contact for a very long time. And it's still going on. I mean, these contact cases are far, far more common than most people realize. There are a lot of cases involving human-looking ETs. And that's what's going on in this really extensive and interesting and certainly controversial case. The sole witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Eduardo Pons Prades. He was born in 1920 in Spain. And he actually became a highly influential author, eventually writing more than 20 books on various subjects, such as the Holocaust, the Spanish Civil War, the dangers of fascism, likely inspired by his time in the Spanish military as a young man, where he rose to the rank of sergeant. So a good witness, and he was very well established in his career when on the evening of August 31st, 1981, he was driving in France near the Prat de Moyer-la-Preste area in the Pyrenees, and he became lost, finding himself on a forested country road. Suddenly, his car stalled for no apparent reason, and unable to get it started, Eduardo decided to hike down the dirt road and see if he could find assistance. So as he's walking along, he sees a light in the distance ahead of him, and he at first assumed it was a house, walked towards it, only to find that it was in fact a large disc-shaped craft, about 75 meters wide, which is almost 250 feet. It sat on 4 landing legs in a field, was brilliantly lit with colored lights, really beautiful, he said, and although they were very bright, strangely, they did not bother his vision, which is normally quite sensitive to lights, so that puzzled him. Totally amazed by this sight, he suddenly heard a voice saying, in a kind of sing-song tone, "Don't be afraid, please approach." It felt almost like a command, and he obeyed. He walked up to this craft, a door opened, a ladder kind of ramp came down. This voice repeated, "Don't be afraid. Come up to our ship. We wish to speak with you." So he climbed up and into this object. He was immediately dazzled by a brilliant white light. After his eyes adjusted, he saw 3 figures, which he eventually saw were Asian in appearance, wearing tight-fitting white jumpsuits and white boots. He couldn't see their faces at first, but eventually did. He did see that their clothes had no seams, not so much as a wrinkle. His attention was drawn to a strange emblem on their chests, and seeing this, the ETs explained that the design showed a drop of water, a type of wings, and a center eye. Then a kind of prism, which they said represented life. Now the room inside this craft was immense, he said. There was an oval table in the center and chairs all around. Everything was spotless white. He did see a control panel with several screens on it. All these beings were sitting at this table. He said it was perfectly silent as they placed a helmet on his head and began to communicate with him. Shortly the craft did take off, And at this point, the UFO occupants held a long conversation with Eduardo. They told him that they were what we call extraterrestrials, and that they had devoted their lives to searching the universe for other forms of intelligent life. And they asked him, "Would you be willing to take a message from us destined for the inhabitants of Earth?" And as Eduardo says, "I answered affirmatively without thinking twice." So at this point, Eduardo wanted to go to his car to get a pen and paper to record all this, but they told him that that would not be necessary, that he would remember everything word for word. He says they spoke to him in perfect, flawless Spanish, but did explain that they were using a translator, and he had the feeling that they could read his mind. So he peppered them with questions. He asked them where they came from. They said they came from different planets, actually named some of them. They said that they had visited many planets beyond Earth. They spoke to him extensively about many subjects, such as war, education, the family unit, morals. They said that their society works in a cooperative without governments or money, that everyone is educated from a very young age, everyone works peacefully with each other, and all are considered equal. All are considered family or friends to each other. They told him that they do not have any bases on Earth, though they do land their ships in unpopulated areas and will remain for months at a time, mostly observing and conducting scientific studies. He said they do reach out and contact people, but generally do not intervene in human affairs. But on rare occasions they have. They told him that they have rescued groups of people from various natural disasters. They explained that they are a very peaceful people. They told him that there are countless inhabited planets across the universe. They told him that they exercise great care never to destroy the environment of these planets or any place they visit. He asked about their jumpsuits at one point, and they explained that they wore them for protection against contaminants. They gave him a tour of the craft, showed him samples of various minerals and rocks that they had taken, but they did explain that they do not take resources from Earth, as they have all the resources they need from their own planet, which they said has far more diverse wildlife than our own. They did show him movies of some of the explorations that they have done. At one point they gave him a juice to drink, which he said was sort of a fruit juice, food tablets to eat, which they said was concentrated food. They told him that they have overcome war and most diseases. They told him that Earth, however, is quite barbaric, and explained that he was specifically contacted because of his knowledge about the war and aggression that is going on our planet. Eduardo asked them, and I quote, "Have you encountered other warlike and armed planets like the Earth, whose leaders did not want to establish contact with your civilizations?" Eduardo asked them specifically, "Have you encountered other warlike and armed planets like the Earth, whose leaders did not want to establish contact with your civilizations?" And they answered, "Yes, it has occurred at times, but never with such a dangerous armament as your Earth possesses." Eduardo then asked, "And when that has occurred, what course of action have you established?" The ETs told him that in such cases they withdraw their contacts and limit their interactions, but do keep a close eye on the planet and the population. The main message from the ETs was that humanity was far too warlike, and that we must, quote, "change it or it would not end well for Earth." They told him that open official contact with ETs would never occur until worldwide peace was established on Earth. So there was a lot more said, but after the contact, Eduardo returned to his car, continued his trip to Barcelona. He immediately wrote down his experience when he got there, and was astonished to find that he was, like the ET said, able to remember everything that took place during the encounter, word for word, down to the minutest detail. He says he also had later telepathic contact with the ETs, and he decided to write a book about it, which he did, a Spanish language book, which is titled A Message from Other Worlds. Now his editor and publisher were not happy about this. They warned him that this would likely ruin his reputation, mark the end of his career. However, Eduardo insisted that his story was true, that it was important, that people needed to know that we are not alone in this universe, and he wanted to go ahead with the publication, which he did. And the book did very well, though was quite controversial. There were some who accused him of hoaxing, though Eduardo never retracted his story. He insisted it was true until the day he died. So that's a case that, yeah, has some controversial and unusual elements. I was able to read the book that the gentleman wrote about this case. It is a Spanish language book, which I translated through Google, so it wasn't perfect. But such a fascinating case with so much information. It's pretty rare that people have these extensive conversations with ETs, or certainly we don't often hear about it. But the details in his account certainly match up with so many others I've heard. I think it's legit. It's a fascinating case, and as I said, he stuck to his story to the day he died, saying that this did in fact really happen to him. All right, let's move to another one. I call this next case, We Are Your Friends. This occurred in March of 1982 in Springfield, Missouri. Of all the cases in this compilation, this one is the most brief. We don't have a whole lot of information about it, but I found it fascinating nevertheless because some of the details in this are very commonly reported. And I also found it interesting that although this was a somewhat frightening experience for the witness, she ultimately decided that it was benevolent. This next case is quite short. It's from Linda Moulton Howe and involves an anonymous woman who, on one evening in March of 1982, was driving near Springfield, Missouri, when she says she suddenly lost control of the steering of her car. And looking ahead of her, she saw a light hovering at treetop level, and she felt as if her vehicle was being pulled by an unknown force towards this strange light. Immediately a weird silence settled over her. She says the sound of her engine stopped. She could no longer feel the bumps in the road, and in fact, it felt like the car was floating. The next thing she knew, she was in a clearing surrounded by forest. A silver disc-shaped craft was on the ground, resting on 3 landing legs. A light was shining down on the ground from underneath it, and a set of steps came out on the side leading down to the ground. The witness felt herself being drawn up into the craft. She says she was led through several small rooms to a larger room where there was a platform or a table of some kind in the center. She says it looked like white silver chrome, but it was padded in a way that it weirdly molded to her body. And she knew for some reason that she was to lie down on the table, which she did. Suddenly, she saw about 6 totally human-looking figures surrounding her. They were each about 6 feet 2 inches tall, had very strong muscular bodies, long blonde hair, high cheekbones, and blue eyes. She says they wore tight-fitting brown jumpsuits, shoes, and a belt around the waist, all the same color. On the chest of the jumpsuit she did see an emblem, a circle with the head of a hawk or an eagle, and wings on either side. Now, per the witness, these figures were very friendly, pleasant, caring, and in fact told her, "We are your friends." They explained that they needed to do some tests on her, but that they would not hurt her. The witness says she did feel a slight stinging in the breast area at one point. She felt like they did some kind of injection on either side of her armpit area. But the ETs told her that they wanted to see how Earth women feed their babies, how they are shaped. All this communication was done telepathically, and the witness did have the strong impression that they could read her thoughts. Afterwards, they helped her off the table, and they said basically that they just needed to examine her. They told her that she might see them again sometime in the future. They then led her to the exit. She walked to the door, down the steps, and outside the craft. Next thing she knows, she's back in her car. and turning to see where she had been, she saw the door close in this craft, the legs retracted inside of it, and it took off with a whining, whistling sound, zoomed vertically off the ground, and was gone. And that was it. Yeah, pretty brief encounter, but certainly fascinating. Can only imagine what that must be like to have this sort of experience. It certainly would change the way you think about everything. It's frustrating because I would love to talk to that witness. I'm sure there's a lot more details. I really doubt that this was a one-off. I suspect that there are quite a few other encounters that this person has had, because that's the pattern we usually see in these cases. Now let's move to the next case, and the final one in this compilation, which I call, "What Do You Want Us For?" That is a direct quote from one of the witnesses who was asked that of the ETs. This is an interesting case because it involves 3 witnesses, all of who were taken on board at the same time. It's ultimately a pretty friendly encounter for them, they decided, though initially it was quite frightening and super extensive because they were given a tour of the craft, got some really interesting information, and it's just a little bit different than a lot of encounters that you hear about. This one occurred in 1986 in Kalgoorlie, West Australia, and I think you'll find it quite compelling. This fascinating and very extensive case, multiple witness case, comes originally from researcher Don Boyd and was printed in his magazine The Psychic Australian, but was then retold by Rex and Heather Gilroy in their book The Energy Beings, ET Abductions from Beyond Time. It's a rare case involving 3 men who were taken on board a UFO together. In fact, we know the names of these witnesses: Alan Gosland, Sean Brooke, and Mike Dubin. They were camping in the scrubland outside of Calgary. Calgary is the location of a huge open pit mine. This is a small town in Western Australia. It also contains the beautiful natural area of the Carl National Park. The men were just sitting around a campfire looking at a clear, starry night sky when they heard this weird, loud humming noise. So they got up to investigate the source, and in a clearing saw a bright silvery glow coming from overhead right in front of them. In fact, it was so bright they had to shield their eyes, and as it faded, they saw that it was in fact a large, round, silver, dome-shaped craft hovering just above the ground. Immediately, 2 small humanoids materialized, standing on the ground just below the craft. They were about 1 meter, 3 feet tall, had light brown skin, but were pretty much human looking, though with large faces, large dark eyes, a low thick brown ridge, pointed ears. They were wearing what looked like plastic, skin-tight jumpsuits and white boots. Each of them carried a small metal wand in one of their hands. And they were not that far away. They stood about 9 meters away from the witnesses, less than 30 feet. So Sean whispered to his friend, said, "We better make a run for it." And although all 3 of them agreed that this was a good idea and wanted to do it, all 3 found themselves, quote, frozen to the spot as these beings were pointing their little wands at them. At this point, these beings approached, began to poke and prod the 3 frightened men, who were still unable to move or even speak. The craft now moved silently until it was directly overhead. A round glowing opening appeared in the bottom of the craft, and all 3 men, they said, were levitated up through this door, which shut and then lowered these men back to the floor of the craft. They could now see that they were in a circular room with all kinds of weird-looking alien equipment. Some, they said, looked metallic, others looked almost rubbery. They did see what looked like computer-like television screens, both large and small, on the walls. Mike yelled out to the beings, "What do you want us for?" There was no response. However, 2 more ETs, identical to the first 2, entered the room. Looking out at one of the screens, the witnesses could see the landscape below them receding. So it was clear to them that the craft was now flying away from the original location, which caused them all to become even more afraid than they already were. But events took a surprising turn when the ETs ushered the three men into a clear tube. This also frightened them, but to their surprise, it turned out to be an elevator-type device which lifted them up to the top dome of the craft. And there they saw two more of these same beings. These beings were seated on stools, sitting before what appeared to be some kind of control panel. And one of these beings turns, looks at the witnesses and smiles, and without saying anything, motioned for them to sit down. Now they observed a large screen which now showed that this craft was somewhere out in deep space. The lights inside this craft dimmed, which allowed them all to see outside through oval windows that were encircling the dome. Now these two little ETs were both smiling, and they began to talk among themselves with this unintelligible but kind of melodious muttering sounds. And all three of the witnesses began to slowly relax, and their fear faded away, because it was clear the ETs were not trying to hurt them. After some time, the witnesses were guided back to the elevator and brought to a lower section of the craft, and for a moment were left unattended inside this room. It was just them. They did see a few closed doors and unrecognizable equipment on the walls and ceiling. Suddenly, they were in there only a few moments when, without warning, lights began to flash from the walls and the ceiling, some of them making weird whirring noises. And all the witnesses had the impression that these were recording devices of some kind, and they were being x-rayed or having pictures taken of them or recorded in some way. Then the door opened, the ETs, still smiling, still silent, motioned them through the door into another room and placed them in front of a tall, kind of wide glass-like window, which suddenly flashed with yellow light, and again the men felt that they were being recorded or x-rayed or scanned in some way. Then they were left alone again, and after being in there alone for some time, the men started to become curious, because they could see a closed door with a small sort of gold plastic-looking button about 1 meter above the floor. So they pressed it and found that it opened the door. They went into another room and were shocked to see various animals, poultry, goats and sheep, all in special pens. In another they found a bull with 2 cows. In a third room they found some dogs, kangaroos, and other animals native to the area, all in special pens. So they were looking at all this in complete surprise when suddenly the ETs came into the room, ushered them into still another room with a sort of soft, glowing orange light. The ETs left, closed the door on the men, again leaving them alone. At this point, the orange light in the room faded, and the men were left in total darkness. They then smelled a strange odor, and they all blacked out. The next thing they knew, they were waking up in a standing position, dazed, in the exact location where they had been taken. Looking up, they saw this silver craft moving quickly off into the night sky, and it disappeared in the distance. So the 3 witnesses were shocked, amazed, all agreed that the experience was very benevolent and friendly, that the ETs meant them no harm, and apparently only wanted to study them. Now, they did find out that it was now just past 10 p.m. They estimated that they had been on the craft for about 4 hours, but it appeared that only 2 minutes had elapsed on Earth. So that was another puzzling factor to this very interesting experience. So there you go, a 4-hour long encounter involving 3 gentlemen. And it's really interesting because they report coming back and only 2 minutes apparently had passed on Earth, but the encounter itself lasted 4 hours. We see this in a number of cases where ETs are apparently pulling people out of the time stream. Hard to say exactly how they do this, but it's certainly apparent that they can do things that we are unable to do or even fully understand, because that does turn up in quite a few cases. So there you go, 6 cases involving the ultimate encounter, being taken on board a craft, talking to ETs, getting all kinds of information from them, As we see, probably the most common feature people do describe when they're taken on board is being physically examined. But a lot more happens. It's kind of a misconception that that's what ET contact is all about, being physically examined, because that's simply not true. Contact happens for many, many reasons. So yeah, some really amazing cases, a lot of information. I think these 6 cases alone provide a pretty good cross-section of what it's like to be taken on board and answer a lot of the questions that we have about ET contact. But again, just a tiny, tiny portion of the actual number of cases. It's so much more common than people realize. It's time we stop questioning whether this is actually happening. We know it's happening. Really, we need to move our attention towards understanding ET contact and moving forward with it. It's a subject, I think, that will change the world as we know it. It's why I do this research. It's a very important subject, and we all deserve to know the truth that we are not alone in this universe. It's so obvious when you look at the stars. At any rate, thanks again, guys. I truly appreciate you guys watching and tuning in every week. Thank you so much. And until next week, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next Friday. And here, take a look at this necklace. It's cool, huh? There's a scorpion in amber. This is my Halloween episode. Black shirt, orange undershirt. Having a little fun. See you guys later. Bye.